This episode is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average. Quote now at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, national average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, January 23rd, it is Ed Roberts Day. In 2010, the state of California signed a bill designating January 23rd as a day of special significance to remember the work of Ed Roberts, former disability rights activist often referred to as the father of independent living. We will get into his biography and his activism in this episode, of course, but perhaps the most noteworthy story in Ed Roberts' life, the moment that galvanized his activism, was in 1962, when he had applied and been accepted to the University of California, Berkeley, and he showed up on the first day of school, the move-in day to his new dorm room, along with the 800-pound iron lung that he needed to use to sleep, a result of weakness due to contracting polio about a decade earlier. The university refused to accommodate him and his iron lung. Roberts sued and, moreover, galvanized a student movement and then a larger movement throughout the 1960s, all the way to his death in 1995. So, let's talk about Ed Roberts, father of independent living. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
What a life, what a legacy, but also what a moment showing up with your 800-pound iron lung, and then the university being like, oh, we had no idea.
And what a clear crystallization and baller move, because he's like, oh, am I being turned away because of my disability? Yes, I had been accepted. You were welcoming me here to Berkeley. And the second he shows up with that iron lung, they're like, no, we didn't realize that you had a disability, so you should go away.
Yeah.
And he's like, is this inconvenient for you? Like, really?
But so let's wind the clock back just a little bit. So that's 62 that he shows up at Cal Berkeley. But in 1953 is when he contracts polio. And kind of his the way that he goes about high school and then applying to college is kind of remarkable as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, we've talked a little bit about polio in the past when we've talked about the vaccine and how challenging the illness was for people, even like Franklin Roosevelt, because of the lifelong paralysis that can come out of it. And in the case of Ed Roberts, he was functionally paralyzed from his neck down. It's why he needs the respirator, because he can't independently breathe. But it's something that seemed not to hold back his aspirations at all. He was somebody who at first wasn't allowed to graduate high school because he hadn't taken PE and hadn't taken driver's ed. And his family had to petition the school in order to let him do it, because the only reason he's not taking those classes is because of this pre-existing disability.
First of all, no one should be prevented from graduating high school for driver's ed or PE. But second of all, the fact that he completed most of his high school via telephone, like unable to be in the classroom, is literally listening in almost like a speakerphone would be today or something.
I mean, it's
like
remote
that.
learning before remote learning.
Yeah, that is remarkable in and of itself. I can't imagine how difficult that would be, especially hearing other kids talking or, saying, can you repeat that or something like that. That is tough. But he manages to complete high school. He does his last year, his senior year, in person, which I'm sure is no smart challenge either.
He had to reteach himself how to breathe in order to do it, because he couldn't take the iron lung with him. It's incredible.
Yeah.
And then manages to get into college, in a prestigious college at that, and is just like, okay, I'm ready to learn. I'm not done learning. And the school does not want to accommodate him.
One other tidbit from his teenage years: soon after he contracts polio, he's reportedly tells a story about how he's lying in a hospital bed and he overhears a doctor telling his mother, basically saying, you should hope that he dies because he's going to be a vegetable for the rest of his life. And that's the word that the doctor uses. Roberts then, I think, was known to kind of be sardonic, have a good sense of humor, sense of perspective, the rest of his life, he talks about how, yes, he is a vegetable. He's an artichoke. He's prickly on the outside, but tender-hearted on the inside. But gosh, imagine overhearing that as a 14-year-old.
But I think that that's such a telling detail, though, because that kind of was the institutional response to both physical and intellectual disability, that it is better that these people not live. It's why you have such a strong eugenics surge in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century, and it's precisely targeted not just along racial and ethnic lines, but also targeted at people with disabilities.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. My mother and I were just having this conversation earlier because she was a special needs teacher, and she just talked about the culture of dismissal of people with disabilities. So it was this widely sort of believed that, like, well, you can't learn. Well, people who have disabilities can't possibly learn or can't possibly get anything out of this experience, or that accommodations are too burdensome, too cumbersome for people to be able to maneuver around each person's disability. But it doesn't make much sense when you sort of pull back from that, because at all points in our life, everyone will sort of experience some kind of disability at some point. And those accommodations are crucial to being able to engage and have a healthy quality of life. And at the most basic level, it becomes a human right issue.
Well, and that language of accommodations is so important, because that is where, after he leaves college, Ed Roberts is at the cutting edge, figuring out how to make the world more accessible through a variety of different accommodations, whether it's the built environment, whether it's having aides who help with certain things, in order to demonstrate that it is not the problem is accessibility and accommodation, not something like internally flawed with the person that requires them to be ignored or, institutionalized or what have you.
Yeah. Though, I mean, it's worth noting, I'm sort of fascinated in this moment of this civil rights fight and the solidarity it finds with other civil rights fights taking place at the same time. And I'm just, I think it's no great insight to point out, like, gosh, Berkeley in the 60s, but just this picture of all of the different groups fighting for basic recognition, and humanity. But I wonder, I mean, do either of you have thoughts about how these groups kind of both fought together because it was a moment of kind of advocacy along all fronts, but also, to your point, Niki, I mean, there are differences in the kinds of accommodations and the kinds of discrimination that someone gets if it's for the color of their skin versus an accommodation for, a wheelchair or an iron lung or something like that.
Right. Well, they're treated differently under the law as well, which we can talk about. It takes much longer for disability rights to be enshrined in law, although activists are going to use a lot of the same techniques of, in the case of Ed Roberts, lawsuits, of functionally sit-ins or occupations. And in the case of the disability rights community and the activist community, which Roberts is going to be a key part of, when they are fighting for rights, particularly in the 1970s, late 1960s, they're teaming up with other, as you mentioned, Jody, other big activist groups like the Black Panthers. See solidarity in this fight for rights, for access. It's access against different barriers, but if you can't get into a school because of a wheelchair, you can't get into a school because it's whites only. Like, those are accessibility issues, obviously along very different historical paths and requiring a different set of conditions for dealing with them, how the law looks at them, strict scrutiny versus intermediate scrutiny looks different. But it's not only a place where activists find common ground and common tactics, but of course there are disabled people of color who are also part of this movement and are fighting on a bunch of different fronts.
Yeah, if we were to do sort of a rundown in terms of like disability activists, I mean, lots of women of color, lots of Black women are at the forefront of this movement. The Black Panther Party is instrumental in really bringing attention to a lot of these issues and doing like the sit-ins and the lie-ins and sort of like, people sort of pushing their wheelchairs off to the side and sort of like, you will have to address this. You will have to look at the fact that I have no access to this building. And it's a powerful public display of like, what does it mean to have accessibility? Like, what does it mean to have to navigate a building, an apartment, a business, and not have access to those spaces? And so I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I think like the disabilities movement was probably one of the biggest, diverse, most like solidarity, coalition building movements that we've seen in this country.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
If you go and you find photos of the group that came out of Roberts' activism in Berkeley in the 60s, the Rolling Quads was the name they gave themselves. But incredible name. But there's photos of them protesting on campus or having meetings on campus alongside Black Panthers and others, and there's photos of them at marches with signs that say "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." An MLK quote. So clearly there's that sense of solidarity. Want to talk about some of the specifics that come from his activism, and this I guess sort of goes through the 60s into the 70s into the 80s. The ADA then eventually gets passed, but one specific thing, and we should give a shout out to our former Radiotopia friends here at 99% Invisible, who did an episode about curb cuts, right? A huge innovation, something we don't really think about now, but the fact that when you get to an intersection, the road dips down a little bit and you can come across it. And that's not just someone in a wheelchair who takes advantage of that. When I'm walking my daughter in a stroller, or just anyone who needs a little accommodation.
Listen, my knee surgery has opened up my eyes to a lot of like, oh my God, it's so hard getting upstairs or like getting in and out of cars and being able to like cross the street. Like, and my disability is temporary until I heal. But, it really does let you know, like these accommodations help everyone. This is why I say everyone will experience some sort of disability during their lifetime. It's almost impossible not to. But those cutouts, those moments in which we see like public access being made accessible for everyone, is huge. There's
a quote from an activist who says, if you're trying to get across the street and there are no curb cuts, 6 inches might as well be Mount Everest.
Yeah, there are all sorts of innovations, obviously, in the built environment, and that's what 99% Invisible is so good at, is charting those spaces that we now just kind of take for granted and how they came into being. But also just, again, in the structures and programs and legal services that people need to live independently, because that was Ed Roberts' big thing, was independent living. And so that could mean anything from having an attendant that goes along with you to help you with certain tasks, accessible housing, mobility training, peer counseling, all sorts of
service animals.
Like things that just make the world more navigable, because, the changes to the built environment help a lot, but sometimes you need a little extra help. And this idea of independent living is so important because it's coming in an era in which institutionalization had been the norm, where there just weren't options for that kind of independence. And that is something that Roberts helps call into being, create, which has absolutely changed the world for people with disabilities.
So like a lot of the activists we talked about on this show, he kind of floats back and forth between the grassroots sphere and the political environment. And so, he does in the 70s get appointed by Governor Jerry Brown to head the Department of Rehabilitation, which had rejected his job application earlier and called him unemployable. And it's like the actual Department of Rehabilitation is supposed to understand these things, but they don't hire him. But then eventually he gets appointed to lead the agency. And, as the director, he facilitates the establishment of independent living centers throughout the state, has a massive impact on California, which then I think shows a model for other states and the rest of the country. Any other notable kind of political wins or notable elements? And then, we're heading towards into the mid-90s when he does die at the age of 56. And then we have Ed Roberts Day, signed in by Arnold Schwarzenegger about 15 years later.
I do think it's cool that his wheelchair is in the Smithsonian. I think that's really powerful to be able to see like these displays of activism and humanity preserved for people to see.
I also think it's important that he lived until the mid-1990s because listeners are probably familiar with one of the biggest civil rights pieces of legislation in the last, third of the 20th century, which is the 1990 Americans with Disability Act, which I think sometimes gets overlooked because it's sort of outside of that time period when we think about big sweeping civil rights legislation. And we don't necessarily think about the ADA as civil rights legislation, but it is an enormous victory and an enormously powerful tool for disabled people to use in order to access all of these new services and to push back against non-accommodation.
And I think we've thought about doing March 12th, 1990 as a date to kind of link into all this. And that was the day that bill was getting signed. But that was the Capitol Crawl, which is when thousands of disability activists in their wheelchairs came to the steps of the Capitol and then came out of their wheelchairs and crawled up the steps. And the power of that moment was incredible and really applied pressure. And the ADA did get passed on that day. But that's another date to keep in mind coming up in a couple months in this story. And Ed Roberts lived to see that. And then we get to 2010. Arnold Schwarzenegger signs this day. I feel like a couple times on the show recently we've kind of gotten into the nitty-gritty of what counts as like a holiday or where it gets put and whatever. And so this is a day of special designation or something. I mean, schools are not off. People don't get paid time off. But it is a commemoration, and I think is worthy of marking. But maybe someday we'll actually have a proper holiday to acknowledge some of this stuff. But given how long it took MLK Day, as we talked about recently.
That might be a while.
Might be a while. Sometimes symbolic change is what you get, and sometimes it has to be sufficient for the moment.
I suppose, at least teachers can play this podcast to their students from here on out.
That's right.
All right. Let's leave Ed Roberts there, and we will turn to, also on this day, other things that happened on this day, January 23rd. So, in 1932, on January 23rd, New York Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt announced his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination, and then he did that over and over and over and over and over again.
And over and over and over and over.
I love this one. In 1977, the miniseries Roots, based on Alex Haley's novel, began airing on ABC. And maybe because I did a little book called Reconsidering Roots on Roots.
And a couple episodes on this show that we've done on that. But
sure did. Shameless plug.
There's no greater Roots expert than the person sitting right here in this tape. And I know we did a full episode, but it was a hit right off the bat, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
instant hit. Instant hit, yes.
Good time to rewatch it. And on this day in 2020, Chinese state media said the city of Wuhan would be shutting down outbound flights and trains, trying to halt the spread of a new virus that had sickened hundreds of people and killed at least 17. And I think we all know that they did not succeed in that mission.
Yeah, so I mean, look, we're entering that phase where you can think back 4 years ago and sort of do the TikTok of also on this day. But I mean, the interesting thing here with this date, it's like that's January 23rd. I mean, for Americans, I think that March 13th or, March 12th date is the one that's seared into our memory. But it's important to remember that, for other folks, it's earlier days. But I think everyone who lived through the pandemic has that day. And for some people, it's late January. And for some people, it's, mid-March. But yeah.
And that
for me, it's March 12th.
March 12th. That's the one.
The day I had Coco.
Oh, right.
The day I had my daughter.
Incredible.
It's the day the world shut down.
Incredible. What a cosmic.
I know.
Yeah. Have you talked to her about that?
Yes and no. I mean, she has to wait till she gets older.
A little older.
She's right now 3.
Yeah,
a little young.
You're getting there. But yeah, wow. Another reason you will never forget that day, as if you would ever.
Right.
I know.
All right. Well, we will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's ODOO.com/thisday.
Radiotopia. From